Hello, I'm Timothy Duke, and I'm here to give you an audio version of a series of books of Proof the Bible is True. It's a series of 9 books that I have written that follows Chuck Missler's course in Learn the Bible in 24 Hours. It doesn't include all the books of the Bible, but it does give you a start as to learning how the Bible is integrated in all the books, and that there is proof that the Bible is true, basically derived from prophecies that were given 1,000 years ago to fulfillment many years later. We're going to start off with the first book in the series of Proof the Bible is True, which covers the first 5 books of the Bible that were written by Moses. And it's from the beginning of Adam and Eve, and it goes through Deuteronomy. Then if you look at the table of contents, we're going to start off by discussing the Bible, which is entitled the Holy Bible. And just to give an overview, preface if you will, of what's in the Bible and some of the particulars about it. Then we talk a little bit about the Old Testament. Then we get into Genesis. Genesis is a book that covers 2,500 years, and it's written by Moses, who didn't live during those 2,500 years, so obviously some of the things that he's writing about had to have come from God. And Moses was just essentially the stenographer. Many of the things that he wrote about, he probably did not understand, but he wrote them as God dictated. Each space, each letter that was put into those 5 books. Then we go into Exodus. We cover most of the verses. Then to Leviticus, which most of the verses in Leviticus are really pertaining to the Jewish people in Israel and the various laws that were written down. But I make commentary on some of the chapters, especially chapter 13, which alludes to potentially Ebola or other man-made viruses. Then we get into Numbers, and then Deuteronomy, and then later on in other books in the series we cover some of the other, or I make commentary of some of the other books in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and then we get into the New Testament and then the Gospels, and we end up with the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is interesting in that it is the only book in the Bible that tells you that the reader is blessed just by reading it. And so if indeed you're new to reading the Bible, or if you've been reading the Bible but you haven't read the book of Revelation, I would strongly encourage you to do that. Now, all the things that I am saying is just my opinion of what these various verses are going to be saying and my interpretation, and plus sometimes opposing interpretations and other things that give you some things to think about. But of course, the real interpretation comes when you read the Bible, and I encourage you to read the entire Bible. But just pick out certain verses and read those if you want to start off. And then ask God to give you the wisdom to understand what you just read. Then He may give you something entirely different. And that's the important thing, is what wisdom God gives you to understand a particular or several verses. Now, if you download the series of books, or one of the books, you can find the link that's just down below that you can copy and then go to. Or if you go into the explanation that or the description I've given, I've also given you a hyperlink to the lulu.com in my page that lists the books that I have written. So we'll start off by reading the first chapter, which is the Holy Bible, entitled the Holy Bible. And the Bible is composed of 66 books penned by 40 plus people for 2,000 years. One of the things that I will be doing as I'm reading the Bible is to throw in some additional commentary that's not in the book, to give you a little more flavor, or my purpose of putting in particular sentences. And since the Bible was penned, back to the book, since the Bible was penned by these people over several thousand years, and what I mean by being penned is somewhat like being a stenographer. God dictated all these things that the people wrote that are incorporated into the Bible, and they were essentially just like stenographers. They wrote what was dictated by God. And some of the skeptics, back to the book, some of the skeptics cast suspicions that it was not integrated or true. The Bible can be proven. It is integrated and literal and authored by someone outside of our time domain. As a footnote, that means basically that God is Alpha and Omega. He is the beginning and the end. He watches everything that has happened, and as you probably have heard, that He can inspect your heart for righteousness. And this is what it means by being someone outside of our time domain, in a different dimension, if you will. Back to the book. Every letter and every number was dictated by deliberate design of Elohim, which is the Hebrew name for God. A really good introduction is given by Dr. Chuck Missler, titled Chuck Missler End Time Scenarios, Parts 1 through 6. And that's at YouTube. And I've given you the hyperlink in the book, and so you can just click on the hyperlink to get to that series of videos. Now, one of the things that we should all be aware of is that the third commandment of God, or as the Hebrew writing would have it, is YHVH, and it's pronounced one way to pronounce it is Yahweh. It's pronounced several different ways, as are many other Hebrew names, simply because that Hebrew does not contain vowels. And so as a result, the interpreter or the translator of the Hebrew into English, German, Bulgarian, Pakistani, Chinese, whatever, has to imply or has to decide what the vowels that are missing and input those into the translation. But in Deuteronomy 5, chapter 11, God states, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain." And that's in the King James Version. Now, I grew up believing that it was about language or cursing the Lord's name. Chuck Missler proposed a different meaning that I now embrace. I believe it means that if you are a Christian or believe in Yahweh or God, then you should be a Christian or Yahweh's child 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You should not have to tell people that you are a Christian or wear a sign saying that you are a Christian. People around you should be able to tell that you are a Christian without you telling them. If you say you are a Christian because you're a member of a church or that you attend church service, Christian service once or twice a year or once every week or a couple times a week, but if you act like a child of Satan the rest of the time, you are taking his name in vain. To be a Christian should be a challenge. If you are not being persecuted, you are not walking closely with Yeshua, which is the Hebrew name for Jesus. We are told Yahweh does not give us the spirit of fear in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. Yeshua tells us that Luke chapter 21, verse 12, that before the start of the last 7 years, Daniel's 70th week, or as commonly known as the tribulation, Christians will be persecuted. Do not fear persecution. Expect persecution if you are righteous in Yahweh's eyes. Many skeptics have argued that specific books do not contain prophecy, as they claim the books are written after the events and thus were historical books. Archaeologists have found proof that the books containing the prophecies were written hundreds or even thousands of years before the prophecy was fulfilled. Professor Lawrence Matejek confirmed 50 biblical figures in the Bible and published in the March-April 2014 Biblical Archaeology Review from Purdue University. What does the Bible say about prophecy? It is the most important gift of Elohim, or God. And that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 1. Prophecy in the Bible is more important than witnessing Jesus on earth, as it proves the Bible is the truth. And that's contained in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 19. Only Elohim can prophesy with preciseness the events that will occur in the future, sometimes thousands of years in the future. Biblical scholars count over 8,000 prophecies in the Bible. About 70% of them have been fulfilled precisely. Not roughly like in some of the other prophecy books that you might read, like Nicodemus, or some of the Nostradamus, or some of the other psychics that have been captured in books. Those are kind of vague and don't really get very precise. But if you look at the prophecies, I think the easiest one to look at is the prophecy that Jesus would be portrayed for 30 pieces of silver. And sure enough, Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And there are many other things that go along with that, but that's very precise. And it was fulfilled precisely. Prophecies are not to scare you, cause fear in you or anyone else. They are to prepare the believer for events when they occur. And then when they do occur, you can say, aha. But the last prophecy fulfilled is the return of the Jewish people to the promised land. And that is not the last prophecy, but the last one that's been fulfilled. And that's in Isaiah 43, chapter 43, verses 5 and 6, and Zechariah chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. There are two other prophecies that have been partially fulfilled, and that is in Isaiah 17 concerning Damascus. In verse 1 of chapter 17, Isaiah is prophesying that Damascus will no longer be inhabitable. No one will live there. It is being bombed right now and close to being, or certainly on its way to being uninhabitable, but it's still people still live there. And why is that important? And that's because Damascus is thought to be, and is considered by historians to be, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. And another one is Isaiah 19 concerning Egypt. And one of the more strange things there is that the Nile will actually run dry. And some of the things that are happening today in other countries are actually shutting off, by building dams, shutting off the flow of water into the Nile that flows through Egypt. Some of the most astounding prophecy fulfillment will be the 300 plus prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. And just to get you started on the prophecies, I've listed 15 of those prophecies in the chart that you can see in the book. But essentially the prophecies started occurring by different writers in the book over 3,000 years ago, in 1000 BC. And they had additional prophecies written in 800, 600, 500, 300, 400 BC. Now the interesting thing is that most people consider that there were 400 years of darkness, and that's 400 years was from 400 BC to the time that Jesus was born. There's not much written except in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, Daniel prophesies what's happening during those 400 years. But other than that, the Bible is silent. But in this chart, I give you the year that the prophecy was made, which is not in the Bible, but you have to extract certain things to be able to do that, form a timeline to figure out when Malachi in chapter 3 verse 1 talks about the temple in Jerusalem, and by figuring out when Malachi actually lived on earth, we realize it's around 425 BC, 425 years before Jesus was born. And of course, that's a little iffy as to whether Jesus was born in year 0 or whether he was born in 4 BC or whether whenever he was born, he was born. as a human. But regardless of what precise year he was born, which scholars debate, that Malachi wrote 400 years before that time a prophecy. And Zechariah wrote prophecies, Daniel wrote prophecies 600 years before Jesus was born about Jesus. Micah and Isaiah both wrote about prophecies of Jesus. Being born in Bethlehem was written by Micah. And then in Psalms, which is written by King Solomon mostly, that was over 1,000 years before Jesus was born. And one of the interesting Psalms 22 is that it alludes to the Messiah's hands and feet being pierced as he is killed. And that's really a description of crucifixion. Now, crucifixion wasn't invented as a form of punishment until the Persians did that in the 400 dark years in 400 BC to 180. They were the ones that actually invented the torture of crucifixion. Now the Romans took the Persian form and did a few things different, but still the same type of thing occurred that the Persians invented, which was, nailing a person's hands to a cross and his feet to the cross, and let the person die an agonizing death over many, many hours. And the more you study the Bible, you will discover the new meanings for various verses through asking through the wisdom of God, Elohim. You read a verse and you don't quite understand it, or maybe you do think that you do understand it. Still ask, but there's a question in your mind. Then you should ask God to give you the wisdom to understand it as he wrote it. Now, is prophecy being fulfilled today? Yes, it is. We already talked about a few, but while most of the prophecies are related to the Middle Eastern nations, some prophecies are being fulfilled in America. Remember the verse, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9, the thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. And essentially we refer to that as history repeating itself. A Messianic Jew, which is a person who is a Jewish person who believes that Jesus was the Messiah, is Rabbi Jonathan Cahn, and he wrote a book called The Harbinger. Now, he has made a movie that captures the essence of how America is repeating an old Jewish kingdom that's in the Bible. And it is very good as it relates to America's warning of destruction on September the 11th, 2001, or what we refer to as 9/11. And he relates in his book how America is following the same things that the Jewish people did, that's in the Bible, in Isaiah. And it's his video. He has a YouTube video that he discusses the Harbinger, and it's called The Collapse of America, and that was done in September 2015. And the subtitle was, Will the Stock Market Crash? Is This Real? Watch Now. And then there's the link to the hyperlink in the ebook that you can click on to watch that video. It's really good. Now, another video by Trey Smith is really good, establishing a timeline that helps put the various events of the Bible in perspective. And it's also on YouTube. So you can look up Trey Smith, and you spell Trey, T-R-E-Y, Smith, S-M-I-T-H. Or if you get my ebook, you can just click on the hyperlink of Entities, the Unseen Realm of Angels, Ghosts, and Demons. It is now science fact. Now, some of the prophecies being fulfilled today are Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, Genesis 19, Isaiah 9, Isaiah 17, Isaiah 19, Ezekiel 32, Jeremiah 49, Jeremiah 50, Amos 4, verse 7, and Luke 21, verse 11. And the prophecies are increasing, and the intensity are increasing, that Luke 21:11 speaks about, and that is earthquakes and pestilences on earth. I also have a chart that shows the very few earthquakes that occurred in the 18th century on earth that were recorded, less than one a year around the world, that were a magnitude of 4, which is considered to be a major earthquake, or even the really big ones, which are of 6 and above in the seismic index of how hard they shake. So I've gone back and looked through, and you can check those numbers from the United States Geological Service, and other countries have earthquake reporting reports online that can be downloaded, and you can check my calculations. But when you look at the calculations, there were less than one a year from 1800 to 1900. In 1900, they started to pick up, and they continued to increase in stepwise fashion, that they would go for 20, 30 years at a certain rate of maybe 10, 15, 20 a year, and then they would jump up to 40 or 50 a year. Now we have many more than that in the year from the year 2000 on. These things are increasing, just as sinkholes, which are spoken of in the Bible, are also increasing. There are also prophecies in Psalms 83 and Ezekiel 38 and 39, which some people refer to in Ezekiel, those two chapters, as Armageddon. But one of the things that Ezekiel starts off with is describing the countries that are the enemies of Israel, and of course the country names that he gives them are the ones that are from centuries ago, or from the time the Bible was written. But he describes the enemies of Israel, and how now we can convert those ancient names into modern names of countries, and to see how these countries are being put in place to fulfill these prophecies of Psalms 83 and Ezekiel 38 and 39. one of the things to remember about the Bible that Augustine, who is a scholar and a king from many years ago, centuries ago, he discovered that the New Testament is in the Old Testament concealed, and the Old Testament is in the New Testament revealed. Why is that important? Some people consider that the Old Testament is something written for the Jewish people, or something that's just not really important to read. But it is important from the standpoint that it does contain a lot of prophecies, and you understand how those prophecies actually end up being revealed in the New Testament. So Chuck Missler has a favorite saying: is there one page in the Bible that you can tear out and not lose anything of the meaning of the Bible? And that one page is the typical separation page that is put in most Bibles between the Old Testament and the New Testament. His suggestion is you can just rip that out, because it is one continuous book written by 66 books written by 40 plus different authors. Most people attack the authenticity of the Bible concerning the prophecies confirmed in various, or contained in various books. And there are more than 8,000 prophecies. Some of the more famous prophets are Daniel, Isaiah, and there are other prophets that have been under heavy attack by atheists and agnostics. In 2 Peter, Yahweh, the Hebrew name for the unpronounceable name of God of Israel, dictates these words for Peter to write, that tells us that prophecy in the Bible is more sure than witnessing Yahweh speaking to his son during baptism, and Jesus, or Yeshua, being resurrected and ascending into heaven. Today we see many magicians performing impossible acts, and thus their eyewitness accounts of Jesus being crucified could be written off as a magic act. Well, it was a miracle that it occurred, and some of the magicians are satanic in nature and perform miracles, of false miracles. But Elohim, God, is saying that foretelling future events, prophecy, that are proven hundreds or thousands of years after the prophecy is made, is more important or more sure than witnessing the life of Jesus or seeing his crucifixion. No other book has ever had the prophecy, the accuracy of prophecy fulfilled, and certainly not the number of predictions. You know, some people refer to Nostradamus or other famous psychics, Edward Casey or whatever, but a lot of those prophecies that they make, or predictions they make, because they're not really prophecies, the predictions they make are relatively vague, versus God in the Bible prophesies many things, and they have preciseness. You know, for instance, like Jesus was betrayed by Judas for 30 pieces of silver. And that's contained in Zechariah. And that was written 1,000 years before Jesus was even born. And so there is preciseness in the prophecies. Sometimes it's difficult to understand the preciseness because typically we're reading in English rather than in the Hebrew. And sometimes then we have to, we are depending upon the accuracy and the understanding of the translator that translated from the Hebrew into the English. So sometimes translators are men and are not perfect like Jesus, and so they get things wrong. But for the most part, the Bible written in English, like the King James Version, has been well researched. Yes, there are some problems in the translations, but those are well known for most of the problems. And you can understand how things should be. And of course, again, I admonish you that if indeed that you read something in English or any other language of the Bible, and you don't comprehend or understand exactly what it is, or maybe you do have an inkling, or maybe you really do think that you do, but maybe you think there's something missing, then you can always ask God to give you greater wisdom to understand what is in that verse or verses that you have some inkling in your mind that you need to understand better. But perhaps the translators thought it would be easier for the average reader of the Bible to use the word God instead of all the various titles. And in the original Hebrew text, there are a lot of different titles of God. And some of those are pertaining to particular properties. One of the things that's good to understand is that in Hebrew, a person's name is not just a name, but actually has a meaning to the name. Like some names are given to people as, terrible things. Like if you read the book of Esther, that the names of some of the children in the book of Esther that were offspring of a really evil person, they have despicable names. And in fact, despicable is one of the meanings of the names that he gave his child. So why you would do that, I don't know, but names do have meaning in the original Hebrew. But to make it easier for us, instead of giving us all of Elohim's names, we just use, for the most part, the word God in the English Bible, and that makes it easier for us to understand that who we're talking about, rather than is it someone else that could be the Bible verse could be referring to. But I do get a richer meaning by knowing what Elohim's title is used. And the only English version that gives the original Hebrew, Aramaic, which is Aramaic, is a older form of Hebrew title in the scriptures, is the version named Hallelujah Scriptures. And this version is only for really a dedicated person seeking more from the Word of God, for the Bible. But you can get it for free online with a download. I don't think you can buy a book that's written. Hallelujah Scriptures, but you have to view it online, and you can do that either through a computer or through a mobile device. But that's at HallelujahScriptures.com, and you can either click on the hyperlink, or if you or just listening, and you just type it into your device. But it does come with a reference book, fortunately, that helps you look up the different names that are in the scriptures so that you can understand what the meaning of that name is. Now, one of the things that give you an example of how it goes is this graph that is showing you the names of God that are in the Bible. One of those names is El Shaddai, and that means the Lord God Almighty. El Elyon, the Most High God. Adonai, Lord Master. Yahweh, Lord Jehovah. Jehovah Nissi, the Lord my banner. Jehovah Ra, the Lord my shepherd. Jehovah Rapha, the Lord that heals. Jehovah Shema, the Lord is there. Jehovah Tishkimi, you'll have to, I do not know Hebrew, and I'm mispronouncing, I'm sure, some of these words of the names of God, but please bear with me. But they are in the book, written correctly in this chart. But Jehovah Tsidkenu is meaning the Lord our righteousness. Jehovah Mikodishakamim, the Lord who sacrificed you. El Olam, the everlasting God. Elohim, just the word God. Kiana is jealous. Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. Jehovah Shalom, the Lord is peace. And Jehovah Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. And that comes from a thing I got off the internet from Daystar, and you can go to Daystar to find that same thing, and they also give some more descriptions of things. And of course, one of the things I want to do in the series of ebooks is give you the ability to go to different sources that I have used to be able to get into something more depth. So, I'm not trying to tell you this is a way or the way or the best way or whatever, but I'm trying to give you the opportunity to see things in different ways. Now, at the end of that chart, I have a verse from the King James Version, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 15. Moreover, I will endeavor that ye may be able after my decrease to have these things always in remembrance. For we have not followed cunningly devised fables, when we have made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received from Elohim the Father honor and glory, when there came such a voice to him from the excellent glory. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And this voice which came from heaven we heard, when we were with him in the holy mount. We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts. And I suppose one of the things that you can get to this, that Peter is conveying in his words, that by reading the Bible, you don't have to experience the same things that the disciples did when Jesus lived. or before Jesus lived. I mean, it'd be it's impossible to live 4,000 or 5,000 years, which we're at, um, since the world started. At least 5,000. You know, most people put the age of the Earth somewhere around 6,000 that are biblical scholars, that man has been on Earth. And of course, there is a question about whether or not that the Earth actually existed many years, centuries, thousands of years prior to Adam and Eve coming on Earth, being made by God on Earth. But some prophecies have already been fulfilled. Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies during his life, crucifixion, and resurrection. Some of the prophecies were written 1,000+ years before his birth. Enoch started the first prophecy. Some of the prophecies are being fulfilled in our lifetime. Hal Lindsey is a Bible scholar of high renown. Dr. Lindsey has researched the prophecies of the Bible and has counted over 70% of all the prophecies have occurred. He's also on YouTube if you want to listen to him on YouTube, Hal Lindsey that is. And all the prophecies fulfilled are precisely fulfilled, just like Judas taking 30 pieces of silver to betray his friend, and the 30 pieces of silver ends up in the potter's hand. And that's in Zechariah 11, verses 12 and 13. Daniel chapter 9, verse 25 prophesies the exact day that Jesus would come to Jerusalem and be proclaimed king. Now, he prophesied that day over 500 years from the date of the prophecy being fulfilled. Prophecies fulfilled authenticate the Bible. Peter tells us that prophecy is the more sure way of faith. The Bible is the only book in the world that makes predictions or prophecies hundreds of years in advance, and some are thousands of years before the event occurs. The fulfillment of prophecies authenticates the Bible and proves that Elohim is outside of our time dimension. You may ask why that proves he's outside of our time dimension. If he's talking about things 6,000 years ago in first person, then he obviously, as a human, would not still be alive. So he's written about things hundreds or thousands of years ago that happened, and things that will happen in years or in the future that have not yet occurred. And so to be able to do that, it has to be like one person, I think it was Chuck Missler, mentioned, that'd be like watching a parade. You can stand in one spot and watch the parade go by, or like God, you can be above that in a different dimension, and he sees the start of the parade while it's being formed, and he also sees the end of the parade where it disperses, all at the same time. So he's able to see these things because he's outside of our time dimension. And depending on your decision whether to believe one man's opinion of the Bible, who studied the Bible in the 12th century, a mathematician, Nicodemus, and he concluded after studying the original Hebrew that there are 10 dimensions, of which 4 are knowable, which would be things that were normally seen, which is length and width, height, and time. And there are 6 dimensions that are unknowable. Well, that was written in the 12th century by a mathematician. And then 600 years later, there was a development in mathematics and physics that's generated from essentially Max Planck quantum theory. And in quantum mathematics, people in the mid-1960s came up with a concept called the string theory. The string theory, when it was first proposed, had 10 dimensions. 4 are knowable, 6 are unknowable. You have to have special training to be able to even conceive of those other 6 dimensions. Now, since that initial theory that was proposed by these men in the 1960s, there have been other people, other mathematicians, other physicists that have proposed theories that are fewer than 10 dimensions and more than 10 dimensions. So it's nice to know that God prophesied that in Moses over 4,500 years ago, a mathematician in the 12th century, 500 years, 600 years ago, or pardon me, 700 years ago, realized by reading the Hebrew Bible that there were 10 dimensions. And then we have, just in the last 100 years, we have mathematicians that are now discovering that the Bible was true, that there were 10 dimensions. And then, of course, right after that, we have people that are proposing that there are less and that there are more. So, since I believe the Bible, I believe in God, I have faith in God, I stay with 10 dimensions. But that's to give you an idea of how some prophecies are somewhat hidden. You can read say a child or a teenager can read all the words and understand what is meant by the words in the Bible, but that doesn't mean that there are not meanings that are underneath that. It's kind of like stating an innuendo in today's English language. Yes, it means something just by the way it's said, but it can also mean something else. And there are double innuendos, triple innuendos, and multiple innuendos. So, one statement or one word can mean multiple different things. It depends on your particular training, your particular depth of knowledge, and what you're willing to study to define those other types of meanings or other meanings of a particular word or phrase. And we'll get into some of that a little later on in specifics. But prophecies do authenticate the Bible when they're made thousands or hundreds of years ago and then are fulfilled. Muslims call one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of agnostics and atheist scholars, especially prior to 1960, really attacked certain books of the Bible as being historical. One of the most attacked books in the Bible is Daniel, as it contains very detailed prophecies that have been partially fulfilled. Many of the arguments are dismissed. Of course, some of the prophecies that he gives have been completely fulfilled. Many of the arguments are dismissed from these agnostic people or atheists once the Septuagint, which was written in 272 BC, which means that it was 270 years prior to the time that Christ was born, and Daniel writes about some things that happened after Christ was born, 500 BC, 500 years before Christ was born. So once the Septuagint was found, then that authenticated Daniel as being a prophet, because it was written in 272 BC, which is well documented by many historians. The Septuagint, which really means 50 scholars that, or 70 scholars that wrote the translation from Hebrew into Greek, was commanded to be written by the Greek Empire and is well documented. Archaeologists, many were atheists, have authenticated the translation. The Septuagint was a Greek translation of all the Old Testament books written in Hebrew and Aramaic and contained the book of Daniel. Now, Muslims call Muhammad the prophet. Now, I've searched the Quran, which is the holy book of Muslims, and did not find even one prophecy from Muhammad. You can certainly let me know if you find one. J. Barton Payne, in his Encyclopedia of Biblical Prophecy, lists all the prophecies, predicted verses, and how many predict different matters. Separate matters consistent with other subjects in the Bible. And, there is not a book on baptism. The understanding and practice and meaning of baptism is spread throughout the Bible. In the same manner, there are more than one instance of prophecy on an important subject. Payne lists 8,362 predictive verses, 1 in 17 predictions, and 1,817 predictions, and 737 different manners. Elohim knew that people would try to remove verses, as the Gnostics did in Alexandria, Egypt. So all the major doctrines are spread throughout the Bible and therefore repeated many times. So that way, it's much more challenging and difficult for someone to actually remove an important topic that God believes everyone should know. Some churches today teach they have replaced Israel in the Bible. It's called replacement theology. And to avoid embarrassing questions, they do not teach the book of Revelation at all. But, as I said before, Revelation is the only book in the Bible that claims a blessing to all that read and understand it. Well, actually, read it. You need to ask God to help you understand it. And there are many different scholars that understand different things in the book of Revelation differently. And they're all good people. Since it is in the future, it's a prophecy, decide which one that you like and stay with that, or start with that and then later on change. But by reading those commentaries or listening to mine, it gives you an array of thoughts that a particular verse or word in the book of Revelation may be stating. Now, other attacks the Bible because it contradicts Darwin's theory of evolution. And we call those people that are Darwinians, and they have never proven the concept of evolution, yet is still being taught in schools. Of course, now I believe that the reason why Darwin was introduced into textbooks and is the and evolution is the only concept being taught is because of Satan. I mean, after all, he is in charge of the earth, yet he knows his time is short. But he still tries to interfere with God's plans. And I think part of his interference is in this particular thing with Darwin and the Darwinian concept of evolution. You know, one of the things that has happened in the 1960s was that DNA was discovered and mapped. Now, there are many people that were scientists, me being one of them, that very science heavy in my academic career. And one of the things we used to say to each other was that if you don't understand something, it's religion, and if once you do understand it, it's science. But one of the things that I've come to learn is that it's probably, it's certainly not the first, though some people do have faith, and it's only a matter of faith. There's no science to back it up. But certainly science is not ever settled, because we are continuously discovering new aspects of science about particular theorems or theories or hypotheses that were made years ago, have been accepted by the scientific community and then proven wrong, or proven not quite correct. For instance, just like with the DNA, it was discovered in the 60s and mapped out later on. And then the interesting thing was that on their first announcement of the mapping, they said that 40% or 50%, I forget what the number was, but most of a lot of the DNA that's contained in a human was junk. It had no meaning. And so as a result, they essentially disregarded it. Kind of reminds me of doctors 100 years ago or 50 years ago thought that tonsils were needed perhaps for a human many centuries ago, but is not currently needed. It's junk in the human body. And so for many years they removed tonsils as elective surgery, essentially, or as surgery, if a child had a cold or something, well then, or it was in the hospital for whatever, they would take out the tonsils as just getting rid of something you didn't really need, and so they would discard. Now they find the newest doctors or medical science has that tonsils serve quite a purpose, and they're very important in helping your body fight disease. And so God had a real reason why he generated tonsils in a human. Some people say that appendixes were used to be used, and they were taken out for many, many years because they were no longer needed by humans as thought by doctors at the time. And today they realize that appendixes do serve quite a purpose. Some doctors think that tailbones on a human are vestiges or remnants of the tail that humans used to have, but since the evolution of the human caused the tail to fall off, that's just what's remaining that tailbone that still is in the human body. Well, the interesting thing is that some scientists actually that believed in God, or maybe had no belief at all, but were secular, I just started to examine what that meant, because some, and probably a good reason why you should not take a teacher as saying everything true, even though they think it's true, that it is actually true. And so some students looked at the tailbone and they started just looking at the muscles that were connected to the tailbone, and realized that if indeed that a tailbone was removed from the human by surgery or whatever, that there would be many things in your body that wouldn't function correctly, because there are many muscles that are tied to the tailbone. So the moral of that story, that little quip, is that just because a teacher or other respected person tells you something that you can sense they feel is true, may not actually be true. Just like I grew up thinking that when I saw the geological column, which means that there is strata of Earth, that the oldest Earth was at the bottom, and then over millions of years layers built up, and the geological column shows those layers being built up, and then we have the very top, today. Well, as it turns out, that geological column is just theoretical in concept and structure, and has never been proven to be true, and has never been found. There's no empirical evidence. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting is that they say that dinosaurs existed 60 million years ago, and humans, whether they call them Neanderthals or whatever, didn't exist until tens of millions of years after that. Well, the interesting thing is that there are many places around the world, including many places in the U.S., like the Grand Canyon, or in Texas, or in many places, that show in a layer that's been a layer of earth that has been excavated, and they see footprints of dinosaurs. They also see footprints of humans at the same, so therefore they would be at the same time, not tens of millions of years apart. And so, while some people may think, and may very learned people, very studied people, respect them for their aptitude to really spend a lot of their time to understand something as well as they can, even with all that study and with all the thinking that's involved in that the conclusions, what they're teaching you, may not be correct. So don't simply swallow it. If something doesn't strike you right, well then question it, just like the people did when they started looking at the muscles that are connected to the tailbone. So as we continue on with the DA, thereafter, because of the complexity of the DA, mathematicians and physicists, I'm not saying all mathematicians or physicists, but some mathematicians and physicists quickly dismissed the Darwin theory of evolution as being impossible to occur as physicists as a random occurrence, as Darwin proposes. Human DNA has over 3 billion possible combinations. The probability of human DNA, of a human DNA strand, being formed in a random Darwinian process is 1 times 10 to the 650th. Now, that's a huge number. That's a 1 followed by 650 zeros. Okay? So if you're trying to get your arms around this number, this 10 to the 650th, you know, if you played Powerball every day, every week, 52 weeks a year, for the next 10,000 plus years, and you add all those probabilities together, you would be getting close to 10 to the 650. That's winning every day for the next 10,000 years. And you're picking the numbers at random. So mathematicians and physicists have studied a lot of probability as to what's realistic and not. And so they've come to the probability that anything this large, anything larger than 10 to the 50th, is done by, is to be observed. I can't pronounce the word. Observed to be done by random chance. Just as the chance of a person winning every Powerball for the next 10,000 years is observed. So essentially anything over 10 to the 50th is just considered to be unbelievably as being random. It has to be created. There has to be intelligent direction to cause it to happen. And I'll end that one. This point here. So I can shut this off.